If he had walked away that afternoon, no one in that county would have ever known what was happening behind those barn doors. And maybe that was the point. The latch was locked from the outside. Jack Turner noticed that before he saw her. The metal hook was fastened tight, not carelessly, not by accident. Someone had meant to keep whatever was inside from getting out. The July heat pressed down hard on the ranch, and the wood of the barn felt warm under his palm as he pulled the door open. At first, he only saw straw and shadows. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. This story gets much more intense, and I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Then he saw the girl. She sat on the ground near the back stall, knees pulled to her chest, a ripped cotton shirt hanging loose over her frame. Dirt streaked her legs. Faded bruises, yellow and deep purple, covered her skin in places no hard day's work could explain. When the light shifted and his shadow crossed her, she jerked like a frightened animal bracing for pain. Jack slowly removed his hat. "It's all right," he said quietly. She didn't answer. His eyes moved across the stall. An iron ring had been bolted into the wall. A short chain lay coiled in the straw beside it. Not long enough to walk far. Long enough to stand. Long enough to wait. He swallowed. "What's your name?" he asked. Her lips parted, but no sound came out at first. She tried again, her voice thin and dry. "Emily." The name felt too soft for a place like this. He crouched a little, not close enough to scare her. That was when he saw her wrists. Faint red marks circled them. Not fresh, but not old either. "Who did this?" he asked, even though something in his chest already knew. Her eyes shifted toward the wooden post beside her. 3 shallow cuts had been carved into it, evenly spaced. Not random scratches. Deliberate marks. She followed his gaze. "My father," she whispered. Jack's jaw tightened. 3 times a day. The words barely carried across the stall, but they landed heavy. She didn't cry when she said it. That might have been the worst part. Her voice had no surprise in it. No drama. Just routine. "He drinks," she added after a moment. "Then he locks the door." Jack had known Frank Miller for years. Small-time horse trader. Regular at the Rusty Spur Saloon. Loud laugh. Short temper when the cards didn't go his way. Frank had told people his daughter was troubled. Sick in the head. Hard to manage. This didn't look like sickness. This looked like control. Jack stood slowly, feeling something shift inside him. Not just anger. Shame. Because he had heard rumors. Because he had seen the way Frank grabbed her arm once in town. Because he had told himself it wasn't his business. Outside, boots crunched over gravel. Frank was coming back from the well. Emily's shoulders stiffened at the sound. Not panic. Just expectation. Jack had a choice. If he walked out now, he could pretend he had come for the bay gelding and nothing more. He could tell himself a father had the right to discipline his own child. In this county, blood still carried weight. The law didn't interfere much inside family fences. But he had once watched another man drink his way into violence and done nothing. He still carried that regret like a stone in his pocket. He wasn't carrying another one. Frank stopped 3 steps from the barn when he saw Jack standing there. "Well," Frank said, setting his bucket down. Didn't expect company. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "She gets dramatic in this heat," he went on casually. "Girl's got a wild streak." Jack didn't move aside from the doorway. "She's locked in," he said evenly. Frank shrugged. "She runs off. I keep her close. That's called parenting." Inside the stall, Emily stayed silent. She didn't defend herself. She didn't beg. She just watched Jack the way someone watches a rope in another man's hands, waiting to see which side he stands on. Jack kept his voice calm. "I'll take the gelding," he said, "and I'll hire her to help on my ranch. I'll pay fair." Frank's expression changed. The smile thinned. "She ain't for hire. She ain't livestock either," Jack replied. That was when Frank lunged. No warning. Just whiskey breath and a fist aimed hard. The first punch caught Jack in the shoulder. The second never landed. Jack grabbed Frank's shirt and drove him back against the barn wall. Wood rattled. A horse kicked in its stall. Frank swung wild. Angry. Desperate. Jack kept his movements tight. One solid hit to the ribs. One shove that sent Frank stumbling into a feed barrel. For a second, everything froze. Then Emily moved. She grabbed a fistful of straw and threw it straight in her father's face. Not brave. Not planned. just enough to break his focus. Jack reached up, pulled the key from the nail beside the door, and unlocked the stall. Frank coughed, wiping his eyes. Jack stepped between him and his daughter. "If I hear you laid a hand on her again," Jack said quietly, "I won't come back alone." And for the first time, Frank didn't have a smart answer. Jack's wagon rolled away from the Miller Ranch under a sky that felt too wide for what had just happened. Emily sat beside him on the wooden bench. Wrapped in an old canvas coat, he kept behind the seat for cold mornings. It swallowed her frame. She held it tight at her collar, like someone afraid it might be taken back. Neither of them spoke for the first mile. The wheels creaked. The horses moved steady. Dust lifted behind them in a pale trail that slowly swallowed the house she had just left. She didn't look back. Jack noticed that. Most people would have. Even after something terrible, they would have glanced over their shoulder one last time. But Emily kept her eyes forward, fixed on the road like it was the only thing that made sense. "You thirsty?" he asked after a while. She nodded once. He handed her a tin cup of water from the small jug under the seat. Her hands trembled when she reached for it. Not dramatic shaking, just small, constant tremors that didn't seem to stop. She drank too fast and coughed. "Easy," he said softly. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. "Sorry, you don't owe me that word," he replied. That seemed to confuse her. They crossed the shallow bend of the Arkansas River just before sunset. The wheels groaned against stone. The horses snorted as cool water splashed around their legs. For a brief second, Emily closed her eyes when the breeze came off the water. It was the first peaceful thing she'd felt all day. By the time Jack's ranch came into view, the sky had turned orange and deep purple. The land stretched open and quiet. No locked doors. No heavy footsteps. When the wagon stopped, Emily didn't move right away. "You're safe here," Jack said gently. She stepped down slowly. Her boots touched dirt that wasn't packed tight by fear. Inside the small ranch house, everything felt simple. A wooden table, a cast-iron stove, a narrow hallway leading to 2 rooms. "You can take that one," he said, pointing to the smaller bedroom. "Door locks from the inside. Only you'll have the key." Her head snapped toward him when he said that. "Inside," she repeated, like it was a foreign idea. "Inside," he confirmed. He set the key on the small dresser. Then he stepped back into the hallway, giving her space. "I'll be out here if you need anything." She stood in the doorway for a long moment before walking in. That night, Jack sat at the kitchen table longer than usual. He didn't light the lantern bright, just enough to see. He kept listening. Around dusk, he heard it. Movement. Not loud, just the soft creak of a floorboard. Emily stepped into the kitchen slowly. The sky outside had gone dark. She was counting. He could see it in her eyes. Waiting for something. Bracing. "It's just evening," he said gently. "Nothing's coming." She swallowed. "This is one of the times," she admitted quietly. 3 times a day. Morning, midday, night. Her body had learned the schedule even if she wished it hadn't. Jack stood up slowly. "Come help me feed the horses." She hesitated. Now. They walked out into the cool night air. Crickets filled the silence. The moon hung low over the pasture. He handed her a small scoop of grain. "You pour. I'll carry." It wasn't about the horses. It was about breaking the clock. As they moved from stall to stall, her breathing slowly changed. Less tight, less shallow. No door slammed. No boots approached. No lock clicked shut. When the last horse was fed, she stood still in the quiet. "It passed," she whispered, almost to herself. Jack nodded. It did. Something small shifted in her posture. Not trust. Not yet. But maybe the first crack in the wall she had built to survive. The next morning, Jack rode into town. Sheriff Mark Caldwell sat with his boots up on his desk, hat tipped low over his eyes. He didn't look surprised to see Jack walk in. "Morning," the sheriff muttered. Jack closed the door behind him. "I need to talk to you about Frank Miller." That got his attention. Jack told him everything. The locked stall, the chain, the marks on her wrists, the cuts carved into the post. Mark listened without interrupting, jaw tight. When Jack finished, the sheriff leaned back slowly. "You stepped into something heavy," he said. "I know." Mark rubbed his face. "Frank was here at dawn." Jack felt his stomach drop. "He filed a complaint," Mark continued. "Says you kidnapped his daughter." There it was. Not fists this time. Paper. Law. Reputation. In this county, Mark said carefully, a father's word still carries weight. Jack held his ground. Bruises should carry weight too. Mark didn't argue, but he didn't promise anything either. When Jack rode back to the ranch that afternoon, he saw Emily standing by the fence, staring at the horizon. She must have felt it in the air. "He won't stop," she said quietly before he even reached her. Far down the road leading from town, a thin line of dust was rising into the sky. Next, the dust didn't rush toward them. It moved slow, steady, like it already knew it had the right to be there. Emily saw it before Jack said a word. Her fingers tightened around the fence rail, but she didn't run. She didn't hide. She just went very still, the way people do when they've learned that panic only makes things worse. Jack stepped down from the porch and stood beside her. "I count 3 riders," he said quietly. She nodded once. He never comes alone when he wants to scare someone. As the figures grew clearer, Jack recognized them. Frank in front, 2 men behind him, Tommy Reed and Carl Benson. Both spent more time leaning against saloon walls than working honest jobs. Neither wore a badge. Frank pulled his horse hard into the yard, dust swirling around his boots as he dismounted. "You got something that belongs to me," he called out. Jack didn't raise his voice. "She ain't a saddle." One of the men spat into the dirt. "No need to make this ugly," he muttered, though his hand rested close to his belt. Emily stepped forward onto the porch. She stayed slightly behind Jack, but she didn't disappear inside. That mattered. Jack felt it. Frank saw it too. For a split second, something flickered in his eyes, not just anger. Control slipping. "You think he'll keep you?" Frank snapped at her. "You think this rancher wants your trouble?" Emily's voice was soft but clear. "I'm not trouble." Frank laughed, but sounded forced. "You're my daughter, and I'm 18, she said. The words hung in the air heavier than the heat. Jack kept his eyes on Frank. "You filed a complaint. Sheriff knows where she is. We can ride back and settle it proper." Frank's jaw tightened. "We'll settle it right here." He stepped forward fast, shoving Jack hard in the chest. The 2 men behind him spread out, trying to circle toward the porch. Jack reacted on instinct. He grabbed Frank's shirt and drove his shoulder into him, knocking them both into the dirt. Dust exploded around them. Fists flew. Frank fought wild. Rage and pride mixed together. Jack fought steady, controlled. One punch split Frank's lip. Another caught him across the jaw and sent him stumbling backward. Behind him, Carl moved toward the porch. "Don't," Emily warned. He kept coming. She grabbed a loose fence post leaning against the railing and held it up, hands shaking but voice strong. "I said don't." Something in her tone made him pause. Tommy looked at Carl. "This ain't worth jail," he muttered. In the yard, Frank lay on his back, chest heaving, blood at the corner of his mouth. "You don't understand," he gasped. "Then explain," Jack said, breathing hard. Frank's eyes flicked toward Emily. "She signed it." Jack froze. "Signed what?" Emily's face went pale. Frank realized his mistake too late. Tommy frowned. "Signed what, Frank?" Frank pushed himself up slowly, wiping blood from his chin. "Family matter," he muttered. "Land transfer. Her mama's piece by the river. She signed it over." Emily shook her head. "You made me." Frank's voice hardened. "You signed. You locked me in that stall until I did," she shot back louder now. 3 times a day until I stopped arguing." The yard went quiet. Even the horses seemed still. Jack looked at Frank differently now. This wasn't just cruelty. It was greed. Land along the Arkansas River wasn't small money. It could clear debts. It could save a reputation. Frank mounted his horse again, slower this time. "This ain't finished," he said, voice low. "You want law? Fine. Let's bring it to town." He turned his horse sharply. The other 2 followed without another word. As the dust settled again, Emily lowered the fence post. Her arms finally gave out, and the wood slipped from her hands. "He made me sign something," she said quietly. "I didn't even read it. He said if I loved him, I'd help." Jack felt anger rise, but he kept his voice steady. "Did you sign it free?" She looked at him like the answer should have been obvious. "No." He nodded once. "Then we take it to the sheriff." That night, she barely slept. He heard her pacing once, heard the soft click of the bedroom lock being checked twice. In the early morning light, they rode into Dodge City together. The town felt heavier than usual. Word had already started moving. Inside the sheriff's office, Frank stood stiff near the desk. His lip was swollen. His pride wasn't. Sheriff Caldwell laid a folded paper on the table. A transfer of property, he said. Emily stood straight, hands at her sides. Jack didn't speak for her. He stood beside her. Did you sign this freely? The sheriff asked. Emily lifted her chin. No, just one word. But it didn't shake. The room stayed quiet after she said it. No, it was such a small word, but it carried months of fear inside it. Sheriff Caldwell looked at her for a long moment. Not like a lawman, but like a father trying to measure truth. Take your time, he said gently. Nobody's rushing you here. Emily's hands were steady at her sides, but Jack could see the effort it took. Her nails pressed into her palms, leaving faint marks. He locked me in the stall, she said. Her voice didn't crack, but it wasn't hard either. It sounded tired. He said I wasn't coming out until I signed. He said I owed him for raising me, for feeding me, for everything. Frank shifted his weight. I never. Quiet, the sheriff warned without raising his voice. Emily swallowed. The first day I said no. He didn't hit me that time. He just left me there. No water. Next morning, he came back drunk. Said I was ungrateful. Said my mama would be ashamed of me. Her eyes flickered for a second at the memory. That's when he carved the first mark, she continued softly, on the post. So I'd remember how many times I disappointed him. Jack felt his chest tighten. The second day, she went on, he brought the paper. I didn't read it. He wouldn't let me. He just pointed where to sign. Sheriff Caldwell unfolded the document slowly. Frank, he said, not looking up, this deed transfers full ownership of her late mother's river property to you. No compensation listed. Frank's jaw worked. It's family land. I was protecting it. From who? The sheriff asked. Frank didn't answer. Emily finally looked at her father. Not with fear this time. Not even with anger. Just hurt. Mama wanted that land in my name, she said. She told me that before she passed. Said it was my safety. Said no one could take it if it stayed mine. Frank's face hardened. You're too soft to handle land. You'd lose it in a year. It wasn't about losing it, she replied. It was about control. The word seemed to sting him more than anything else. Sheriff Caldwell leaned back in his chair. Frank Miller, you're being held on suspicion of assault and unlawful confinement until this deed gets reviewed properly. You're taking her word over mine? Frank snapped. I'm taking bruises over excuses, the sheriff replied. Two deputies stepped forward. Frank didn't fight this time. He just stared at Emily as they let him out. This ain't over, he muttered. When the door shut behind him, the room felt different. Lighter, but not easy. Emily exhaled slowly, like she'd been holding her breath for years. Jack turned slightly toward her. You did good, he said quietly. She shook her head. I was scared. Courage ain't the absence of fear, the sheriff said. It's speaking anyway. Her eyes welled for the first time, but she blinked the tears back. What happens now? The deed gets reviewed by the county judge, Caldwell said. If it was signed under force, it won't stand. And if what you said checks out, your father will answer for more than just paper. She nodded, but her shoulders didn't fully relax. Outside the office, Dodge City buzzed with whispers. People paused when she stepped onto the boardwalk. Some stared. Some looked away. She lowered her gaze instinctively. Jack noticed. Look up, he said softly. She hesitated. Let them see you standing. Slowly, she lifted her head. An older woman near the general store gave her a small nod. It wasn't loud support, but it was something. On the ride back to the ranch, Emily finally spoke without being asked. I used to think it was normal, she admitted. The yelling, the locking the door. I thought maybe other girls went through it too. Jack kept his eyes on the road. Sometimes when you grow up inside something, you don't realize how wrong it is. She wrapped her arms around herself. What if the judge believes him? Then we keep standing, Jack replied. She studied him for a moment. Why did you step in? He was quiet for a long stretch. Years ago, he said finally, I watched a neighbor drink himself mean. I heard things through the walls. I told myself it wasn't my place. One night it went too far. I still think about that. Emily didn't press him for details. I wasn't about to make the same mistake twice, he finished. Back at the ranch, evenings settled in again. When the hour came, the one that used to mean footsteps and keys, Emily felt it in her chest. She looked toward the house, then toward the open sky. No one came. No door locked. No mark carved. She let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. And for the first time, the silence didn't feel like waiting. It felt like space. The waiting turned out to be harder than the fight. Days passed, and nothing happened fast. No judge rode in with quick answers. No loud victory came knocking at the ranch gate. Life moved the way it always did, slow, steady, almost careless. But inside Emily, everything still felt tight. The first morning after the hearing, she woke before sunrise. Jack found her already outside, sitting on the porch steps with a blanket around her shoulders. The sky was barely turning gray. "You sleep at all?" he asked. She shrugged. "A little." He didn't push. They worked together that day, mending a loose fence line near the east pasture. Jack showed her how to pull the wire tight without cutting her hands. She listened carefully, focused harder than most grown men he'd hired over the years. At one point, the hammer slipped from her grip when a horse neighed too suddenly behind her. She froze. Jack noticed. "It's just Rusty," he said calmly. "He complains about everything." She let out a small breath and nodded. "I know. It's just loud sounds." "You don't have to explain," he said. That seemed to matter. By the third day, word had fully spread through town. Some folks sided with her. Others muttered about family business staying private. Dodge City had always been split between those who believed in law and those who believed blood settled things. That afternoon, Sheriff Caldwell rode up to the ranch alone. Emily stiffened when she saw the badge, even though she knew he wasn't there to harm her. Jack stepped forward. "What's the word?" Caldwell removed his hat. Judge reviewed the deed. "It's suspended pending full investigation. Won't transfer." Emily's knees nearly gave out at that. But the sheriff continued gently. "Frank's lawyer is arguing you signed willingly. Says there's no witness to force." Silence settled between them. "There was a chain," she whispered. "And the marks." "I know," Caldwell said. "And that helps. But court likes proof that stands on its own." Emily looked at Jack, fear creeping back in. "What if he says I'm lying?" Jack met her eyes. "Then we tell the truth again." After the sheriff left, she sat at the kitchen table for a long time, staring at her hands. "I kept thinking," she said quietly, "if I just signed it, he'd stop being angry. I thought maybe if I gave him what he wanted, he'd go back to how he used to be." "How was he before?" Jack asked gently. She smiled faintly, and it hurt to see. "Before Mama got sick, he used to lift me onto horses. Used to laugh. I keep remembering that man." "That's the hardest part," Jack said. "Letting go of who someone used to be." Tears slid down her face then, quiet and steady. Not dramatic, just grief. "I didn't just lose my mama," she whispered. "I lost him too." Jack didn't offer empty comfort. He just sat across from her, present. "You're allowed to miss the good parts," he said after a while. "That doesn't excuse the bad ones." That evening, she walked down to the edge of the pasture alone. The Arkansas River shimmered in the distance. Somewhere beyond that bend lay the piece of land her mother had left her. She tried to picture it, not as money, not as power, as safety. When she came back, she looked different, not lighter, but steadier. "If the judge asks me again," she said, "I won't just say no." Jack waited. "I'll tell him everything, even the parts that make me look weak." "You weren't weak," he replied. "I felt weak. Feeling isn't the same as being." A few days later, the official hearing date was set. The night before, Emily couldn't eat much. She pushed food around her plate, staring at nothing. "What if he looks at me the way he used to?" she asked quietly. Jack understood what she meant. "Then you look back," he said, "not as his child, as yourself." She nodded slowly. Later, when that familiar hour of the evening came, the one that used to bring footsteps and fear, she noticed something. Her body still reacted. Her heart still beat faster, but she didn't feel small anymore. She stood up from the table, walked to the door, and opened it herself. The night air was cool. Crickets filled the dark. No lock, no chain, just space. She stepped outside and let the hour pass while standing under the open sky. And for the first time, she didn't count. The courthouse in Dodge City wasn't large, but that morning it felt too tight to breathe in. Wooden benches filled slowly with townsfolk pretending they had errands nearby. Hats came off. Whispers moved like wind through dry grass. Some eyes carried sympathy. Others carried doubt. Emily felt both. Jack walked beside her, but not in front of her. He didn't guide her by the elbow. He didn't speak for her. He simply stayed close enough that she could feel she wasn't alone. Inside, Judge Harper adjusted his glasses and looked down at the papers stacked before him. Frank sat at the opposite table in a clean shirt, hair combed back like respectability could erase bruises and chains. His lip had healed. His pride hadn't. Emily felt her stomach twist when she saw him. For a second, just a second, she saw the father who once lifted her onto a saddle. Then she saw the barn door closing. "Miss Miller," the judge said, voice steady, "step forward." She did. "Did you sign this property transfer of your own free will?" The room held its breath. Emily could have answered with one word again, but she didn't. "No, sir," she said clearly. "I signed it because I was locked in a stall. I signed it because I was told I wouldn't eat until I did. I signed it because I was afraid." A murmur rippled through the benches. Frank's lawyer stood. "Objection. Emotional exaggeration. There's no physical proof she was confined." Sheriff Caldwell rose slowly. "Your Honor, I personally inspected the Miller barn. Found an exterior latch secured from outside. Found an iron ring fixed to the wall. Found markings on a wooden post. 3 cuts spaced evenly. The young woman's wrists showed consistent abrasion." The judge nodded. "Continue." Emily's hands trembled now, but her voice didn't break. "He carved one mark every time he said I disappointed him," she said. "Morning, midday, night. I stopped arguing because I couldn't take hearing it anymore." Frank suddenly stood. "You're twisting things," he shouted. "I disciplined you. That's my right." Judge Harper slammed his gavel. "Sit down." Frank lowered himself slowly, but his eyes stayed locked on her. Angry, accusing. Emily looked back, not as a child, as someone done being afraid. "My mother left that land in my name," she said. "She told me it was so I'd always have somewhere to go if I needed it." Jack felt something tighten in his chest at that. The judge studied the deed, then Emily. "Miss Miller," he said carefully, "did anyone witness this confinement?" She hesitated. Jack's heartbeat thudded in his ears. Then she spoke. "Yes." The word surprised even him. "Who?" the judge asked. She swallowed. "Myself." Silence. "I lived it," she continued. "I counted the marks. I felt the lock. I waited for the footsteps. I know what happened, even if no one else was there." The courtroom didn't laugh. It didn't mock. It listened. The judge leaned back, thoughtful. "This court recognizes that coercion does not require an audience," he said slowly. "And fear does not become less real simply because it happens behind closed doors." Frank's face drained of color. "The property transfer is void," the judge declared. "Furthermore, charges of unlawful confinement and assault will proceed to trial." The gavel struck. Just like that, the paper lost its power. Outside the courthouse, the sunlight felt different. Brighter. Warmer. Emily stepped onto the wooden boardwalk and exhaled like she had been underwater for years. "It's not over," she said quietly. "There's still trial." "I know," Jack replied. "But the land, it's yours," he finished. She closed her eyes briefly. Across the street, a few townspeople nodded at her. A woman she barely knew touched her shoulder and whispered, "You were brave." Brave. The word felt strange. On the ride back to the ranch, Emily didn't stare at the horizon this time. She watched the fields. "I kept thinking courage would feel big," she said after a while. "Like shouting, like fighting. What did it feel like instead?" Jack asked. "Like my legs might give out," she admitted. "Like my voice would disappear." He smiled slightly. "That's usually how it feels." When they reached the ranch, she didn't wait for him to open the gate. She slid down from the wagon and did it herself. That evening, when the familiar hour approached, she felt it again, that old shadow inside her chest. But instead of hiding from it, she walked straight toward the barn. Jack watched from a distance, but didn't follow. She stepped inside alone. The space was quiet, dust floating in soft light. No chain, no lock, She walked to one of the wooden posts and rested her fingers against it. For a moment, her breathing quickened. Then she picked up a small pocket knife from the workbench. Carefully, she carved a single line into the wood. Not for fear, for freedom. One mark, she whispered to herself. For the day I stopped counting. She stepped back into the open air, shoulders straighter than before. The trial would come. People would still talk. Some would still doubt. But something had already changed. The clock that once controlled her life no longer owned the hours. And that mattered more than anything written on paper. The trial came 2 weeks later, and by then the entire county had chosen sides. Some believed a father had the right to discipline his child however he saw fit. Others had started looking at their own barns and doors a little differently. The story had moved beyond one family. It had become a mirror. Emily felt that weight as she stepped into the courtroom again. This time, she didn't search for Jack immediately. She walked to her seat on her own. When she did glance at him, he gave her a small nod. Not to lead, just to remind her she wasn't standing alone. Frank looked smaller than before. Not physically, but something in his posture had shifted. Pride had been replaced by defensiveness. Witnesses spoke. Sheriff Caldwell described what he saw in the barn. A doctor confirmed the bruising pattern matched repeated restraint. Even Tommy Reed, one of the men who had ridden out that day, admitted under pressure that Frank had bragged in the saloon about breaking stubbornness the hard way. Frank tried to speak over them more than once. It was discipline, he insisted. She's twisting it. But every time he said the word discipline, it sounded thinner. When Emily took the stand again, the room quieted. Do you hate your father? The defense attorney asked, trying to trap her. She thought about it honestly. No, she said. The answer surprised people. I don't hate him. I wish he had chosen differently. The lawyer frowned. Then why bring him here? She met his gaze steadily. Because loving someone doesn't mean letting them hurt you. There was no anger in her tone, just truth. By late afternoon, the verdict came. Frank Miller was found guilty of unlawful confinement and assault, sentenced to time in county jail and fines that would sting more than his pride ever had. He didn't look at her when the decision was read. When it was over, Emily stepped outside into the bright Kansas light. The air felt wide again. Jack joined her on the courthouse steps. It's done, he said quietly. She nodded, but her eyes were distant. I thought I'd feel happy, she admitted. But I mostly feel tired. That's normal, he replied. You carried something heavy. Over the next few months, life settled into something steady. The river property remained in her name. She rode out to sea it one crisp morning with Jack. The land wasn't large, just a stretch of grass bending toward the Arkansas River, cottonwood trees lining the bank. But when she stepped onto it, something inside her eased. My mother used to bring me here, she said softly. She said land remembers who treats it kindly. Jack let her walk ahead. She knelt and pressed her hand into the soil. For a long time, she said, I thought safety was something someone else had to give you. She stood and looked at him. But maybe it's something you build. He smiled faintly. That sounds right. She didn't stay at Jack's ranch forever. By the following spring, she had built a small cabin on her riverland. Nothing fancy, just strong beams, clear windows, and a door that locked from the inside. Because she chose it to, on the day she moved in, she invited a few townsfolk who had supported her. Sheriff Caldwell came, even the older woman from the general store. As the sun dipped low, Emily walked down to the edge of the water alone. The old rhythm still visited her sometimes, morning, midday night, the ghost of counting. Trauma didn't vanish like smoke. But now, when the hour came, she didn't shrink. She would step outside, breathe, let the moment pass. That evening, she carried a small piece of wood from her cabin down to the riverbank. With her pocket knife, she carved 3 short lines into it, not evenly spaced like before. Then she carved one long line across them all. She held it for a moment, then tossed it into the river. The current carried it away without ceremony. Fear had once measured her life in marks on a post. Now time moved forward without permission. Years later, people in the region would still talk about the case. About the rancher who stepped in. About the daughter who spoke one steady word that changed everything. But the real story wasn't about a fight in a barn or a verdict in a courtroom. It was about a quiet decision made in a moment when it would have been easier to walk away. Sometimes the law matters. Sometimes land matters. But what matters most is this. Fear only keeps its power when no one challenges it. And sometimes breaking a cycle doesn't start with shouting or revenge. Sometimes it starts with a single word spoken clearly. No. Years passed, but the story never really left Dodge City. Not because of the trial. Not because a man went to jail, but because something quiet had shifted in people. Emily's cabin by the river slowly became more than a home. It became proof. Proof that fear could be broken. Proof that blood did not mean ownership. Proof that silence was not the same as loyalty. She still had difficult days. Some mornings she woke up too early, heart racing for no clear reason. Some nights she still listened for footsteps that never came. Trauma didn't disappear just because a judge struck a gavel. But she no longer counted hours. Instead, she measured time differently. By how many boards she nailed into her cabin walls. By how many sunrises she watched without flinching. By how many times she chose not to shrink. One late afternoon, almost a year after the trial, Jack rode out to see her land. The cottonwood trees moved gently in the wind. The river reflected gold light across the grass. Emily stood near the water, stronger now. Not untouched by what happened, but rebuilt. I used to think safety meant someone protecting me, she said. Jack studied the horizon. And now? She smiled softly. Now I think safety means knowing I can protect myself. He nodded once. That was enough. Before he left, she said something that stayed with him for the rest of his life. People think what saved me was the court, she said. Were you stepping in? He raised an eyebrow. But what really changed everything, she continued, was the moment I stopped believing I deserved it. That was the truth. Fear survives in silence. Control survives in shame. Abuse survives when people convince you it's normal. But the moment someone stands steady, even with shaking hands, something breaks. The marks on the wooden post had once measured her pain. Now the only marks that mattered were the ones she chose to carve into her own future. And that summer taught Dodge City something it hadn't fully understood before. The law matters. Courage matters. But what matters most is refusing to count the blows as part of your daily routine. Sometimes changing your life doesn't start with revenge. Sometimes it starts with one clear word. No. And sometimes that one word is strong enough to change an entire region.